Welcome. I hope you're having a great SAINTCON experience already. I'm just going to take 2 seconds before I start into my presentation and just say thank you for coming and trusting SAINTCON with your training money or I get to go to one conference a year opportunity and those kinds of things. We're so pleased to bring a high value, great content conference to Utah and to our local community. And so we're super pleased to be able to do it. We're just blown away by the response and how big and crazy it's getting. So anyways, I am Troy Jessup. I go by Jupiter as my handle. I've been doing cybersecurity and InfoSec for longer than before it was sexy and cool. It's about 25, almost 30 years of some sort of cybersecurity or IT-related types of field, which also kind of makes me old, I think. So I'll wear glasses every once in a while up here as well. But we're here to talk today about risk acceptance. And as I was talking to my mom at the end of or at the back of the room here just a little bit ago, this is going to be kind of like, you're all pretty culturally aware about Utah, but this is going to be like that general conference talk that you fall asleep on, Sunday afternoon session kind of thing. Because this isn't that really super exciting kind of topic. It's not the thing that you're coming to SAINTCON to really dig in and learn, but it is an important process that we all could use some refreshers, maybe some discussion, and that there's some gaps that we can maybe fill with some of the information that we have here. And so that's my goal here, is to see if I can fill a gap that you might have or make you think a little bit outside of the box for risk acceptance. But risk is kind of a big deal. So let's talk about risk. Unless you've been hiding under a rock, or whatever, you should have at least some understanding of what risk is. I would assume that I'm mostly talking to IT and security professionals in the room, and so we do risk acceptance all day, every day, 365 days a year kind of thing. And risk is risk, okay? It's hard to really put a solid definition on risk, but it are the things that make us vulnerable to some sort of outside influence coming in and making us have a bad day, right? The risk of a compromise would be one example. The risk of some sort of data breach or data exfiltration or data exposure or those kinds of things. We're all familiar with these types of risks. And our jobs, or what we think are our jobs as IT and security professionals, is to understand that risk and put things in place and everything to try and mitigate it as much as possible. And so risk acceptance, up here I'm saying risk is risk, and it exists regardless of anything we do. Does that resonate with everybody? Whether we do something about a risk that is either identified or not identified, does it keep it from existing? No, it doesn't, right? That risk is going to be there no matter what. It's what we do to either remove the risk or mitigate the risk that makes the difference. And so it's critical to have these types of processes in place. And there's 5 major domains around risk acceptance. If this is super remedial for you, just pay attention, or, kind of drift off for a minute, surf the web, what you're going to do, and then we'll come back to some more important things. But for the refresher, it is critical that when you are in your role as an IT or security professional to identify risk. That's one of your primary jobs. More so if you're a security professional than if you're an IT professional, but one could argue there's a lot of overlap there, right? So identifying it. Defining risk is a key component to a risk acceptance process as well. And I'm going to dig into some of these in a little bit more depth later. But defining it, documenting it. How many of you guys, by the raise of hands, have a process in place within your organization where you have at least some risk that is inherent to your organization documented somewhere on a piece of paper? Maybe it's just an email that I sent up to the CEO and said, hey, this is a bad idea or whatever, right? Okay, and the thing is, I'm not seeing a lot of hands, and that's pretty typical, and part of the reason why I wanted to so badly to do this talk this year, even though it's a kind of a boring, mundane topic, it's super important because we need to be doing a lot better job in risk definition and risk acceptance processes. So documentation, not a lot of us are doing that. How about security controls and other things that are preventing risk? How many of you guys have some security control in place to mitigate risk. Okay, 99% of the hands should go up because if you have a firewall, hey, that's a pretty good security control, right? To start with, there's so many more layers that we can talk about here in a little bit. And then monitoring risk. How many of you guys have had an opportunity to identify some risk, talk about it, maybe come up with some processes to mitigate some of the risk and go through this whole process, and then don't ever revisit it again? You never go back and say, hey, we did that one thing to the server 3 years ago and opened up those ports that we probably shouldn't have, but it was justified at the time. Is it still justified today, kind of thing, right? And here's the thing. I'm already going through half of the slides that I've got prepared by just mumbling here. So this is going to be an interesting talk. This is also one of those talks that I'll just set the stage. I'm riddled with ADD types of tendencies, so I'm going to be all over the place. I hope you can follow along. This particular slide right here, I want to talk about a risk acceptance process in general, okay? Defining and identifying risk, and we document the risk, and we explore compensating controls, but this is where the math comes in. See if you can follow me on the math. Risk minus compensating controls. Everybody understands what compensating controls are, right? We'll cover them a little bit more in a minute, but risk minus compensating controls equals mitigated risk, okay? Should be a pretty familiar math equation for you. And unmitigated risk minus mitigated risk equals risk to be accepted. Does that resonate with everybody? Seems like a pretty reasonable conclusion here. I don't know, I haven't put a lot of numbers into the math equation, so there might be some errors and issues in there, but in essence, that should resonate, okay? And so what I want to do is kind of take us through a couple of these processes, and I promise not to be super long-winded with it, but how do we identify risk, okay? In fact, I'm going to come back here, not let you cheat, and I'm going to poll the audience here. Who has an example of how you are identifying risk within your organization? Anybody have a good suggestion? And there might be a Yoda mini badge or two in it for you. Go ahead. Okay, so gap analysis against security frameworks. Okay, great one over here. Okay, internal reporting, so internal information and things. Actually, I'll just hand these. This is my sweet wife, by the way, who has decided a couple of years ago that instead of being a widow for 6 months out of the year while I work on SAINTCON, she's part of our volunteers and she does so many awesome things. She'll hand out some Yoda mini badges. So internal reporting. Anybody else? Throw them out. Go ahead. Vulnerability scanning, penetration tests. Great one. SOC 2 compliance or regulatory compliance of different types. HIPAA, FERPA, those kinds of things. Did anybody else have any other unique ones back here? Data sensitivity. Take me through that one just a little bit. How does that inform your risk? Okay. In my mind, I'm thinking data sensitivity is a little bit different in my mind than data classification, but I totally get your jive here. Back in the back. Okay, user access and segregation of duty reviews. What do we sometimes find in those types of reviews? Over-privileging, right. Role-based access controls. Like, hey, somebody gave this person administrative access to the Active Directory domain because they needed to install a printer, right? That never got undone. Way back in the back. And then you have a forced process of review again or monitor that risk. Great ones. Okay, so those are all great suggestions. These are just a couple of the high-level ones that I put on the slide. Many of these have already been talked about, but one of the first ones that I don't think we captured really well from the audience was new or change in projects or initiatives. How many of you have had some CFO, CTO, CIO, CEO, we blame all those three-letter people, right? Come down and say, hey, by the way, there's this cool new initiative that we're going to start doing. We are going to put web servers on every phone, right? Or we're going to turn on SSH for every single device because that makes it secure, right? How many of you guys have experienced something like that? Does anybody want to share one really quick? There might be another Yoda mini badge in it for you. That's okay. Oh, go ahead.
As we started doing NASA scans, we identified one of the bad readers that we used in 65 locations all had SSH.
Okay.
So that has turned into a massive spreadsheet that we know about now, but we got to fix it.
Right. Okay. And so identifying maybe vulnerability scan found it. How did you find, or was that some initiative from some higher up? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get to is it's inevitable that you're going to be told, hey, we're doing this new thing. And we got to do it. It's business case and everything else. And you know darn good and well that this is a bad idea, right? Go ahead. Okay, so in case you didn't hear it in the back, he's talking about, hey, we've been having problems with email, and so we're now going to require every single phone to have a VPN. Back in the back, one more, right behind, sorry, one more back, really loud. Ooh, collecting COVID immunization card images and then storing them somewhere on a organization. Hey, that's a great story for the vent event later, okay? In case, I'm sorry, segue, if you're gonna follow my ADD for just a second, that vent event is gonna be off the chain, by the way. If you have these fun stories that happen into a hypothetical organization at a hypothetical time, and you want to go share with other people that can feel your pain, that's a great place to do that. But no, thank you for sharing. So it's things like that. We take in all these new changes and new initiatives and things, and it creates risk that needs to be assessed. And it's going to take us an hour or two to get through all this if I don't hurry. Vulnerability scans, we talked about that. Penetration tests, tabletop exercises. I just had an opportunity just recently to sit in on a tabletop exercise where we involved the FBI, CISA, and a couple of other organizations, the local state SIAC and others, in a tabletop exercise for a healthcare organization within the state of Utah to go through their incident response processes and things. And guess what? There's findings and there's new information and risk that needs to be looked at. Bug bounties, we kind of talked about internal threats and other things. So this is how we find risk. We can look at it all day and we can find it, right? Now we need to define it a little bit. I have this favorite quote that my mentor, one of my mentors, my current boss at the Utah Education and Telehealth Network says, he says, and this will probably resonate probably with many of you, as technical people, we often see the problem and the solution at the same time. You guys ever had that? Now, it sounds like just a little cliche to say it, but I'll give some definition and say, we as technical people really have this problem. It is hard for us to focus on problems and issues without immediately jumping to, we got to solve this. Here's the solution. And it's not a well thought out solution. It's just we are here to solve problems. It's built into our IT DNA, right? We are the problem solver. Hey, my mouse is broken. Well, have you tried unplugging it and plugging it back in kind of things, right? Where that might not be the solution, but we offer those. So defining risk, as we're going through these processes and realizing that risk, or we identify it, but defining what is that risk of having to put VPNs on every single phone to manage email, right? What are those risks? Now, we can talk about, oh, well, there's this, and then here's how we solve it. Or it's important to have time between identifying and trying to solve the problem, think it through, understand it really well, because we often so quickly move to trying to just solve the problem rather than in putting it into a process. And this is where we lose out on a repeatable process that we can do for all of this, okay? And so let's talk a little bit more about defining risk before we get into some of this other stuff. Because I want to just give you some key components that might be helpful and fill a couple of the gaps that you might have. Separate risk from current compensating controls. When you identify something that creates risk within your organization, separate the compensating controls from it first. Think of it as, this is a brand new risk. I don't have a firewall in place. I don't have network segmentation, and I don't have other compensating controls. What risk does that create in that mode? And then build those compensating controls that currently exist back in, and then see where you're at. Because if you always just assume that the compensating controls that you have check all of these boxes over here without reviewing them first, you're going to lead yourself into that trap, as it were, of not having all of your risk, not having all of the compensating controls that you think you have up against the risk that you're trying to assess and define. Okay, real versus hypothetical risk definitions. I added this in here just to make sure that if you're going through this process often, sometimes a hypothetical discussion with you and a couple of your other IT or security colleagues is great. Like, what if the CEO did decide to send out his email credentials to everybody on the planet? Like, what would that be? But likelihood of something like that happening, I don't know all your CEOs or anything, but probably low, maybe, right? But making sure that you keep risk definition real. Don't get too far into the weeds, and that's really what the next slide's about as well, but take the time to think risk through, okay? Because oftentimes if we just jump from identifying to trying to solve the problem, we're not thinking, hey, you know what, that SSH thing that we're trying to shut off, in fact, this will resonate with many of you as well. We just jumped to a solution, we turn off SSH, but then guess what happens tomorrow? Some other department comes and says, hey, we can't run payroll today. Well, why can't we run payroll? Well, somebody shut off SSH on the such and such a thing, right? Because we didn't understand the whole risk to the whole thing. So take time, think this through. In most cases, risk isn't something that you have to just snap your fingers and deal with immediately, at least not if you're doing it well and doing it right, okay? Let's see. Don't just define a single major risk and focus on it alone. That's the other part of this point that I wanted to make, is that it's important to think outside the box, understand the risk holistically rather than just, VPNs are bad for phones or whatever, and just focus only on that piece, because it might not be so bad if there's other components with it. Anyways, moving on. The rabbit hole, as I mentioned, it's impossible to fully define and understand every piece of every risk that you have in an organization. So don't try. Get close, and that's where when we come later on and we repeat and review and we monitor that process, there's nothing keeping us from reassessing this further down the road. Let's mitigate the important risk now. And so work to just understand it is probably the key phrase here. Okay? Next, a critical portion of risk acceptance is documenting this. Okay? We had you raise some of your hands before. Not a lot of you have formal documentation processes. This is a key component for risk acceptance. Okay? Because if you have all of the risk thought through and identified, and it's all up here in Cerebrum, and nothing gets documented, then how are you, I know memory's fallible, but how are you keeping track of all of that? What happens is the most recent risk becomes the thing on top, and the thing that we've learned about a month ago kind of falls by the wayside. And if we're not documenting it and we're not running it through a process, we're going to forget about it. How many of you feel like within your organization there's some risk that we've hashed through, we've identified, we've talked about it, we've done some things, but it never made it past that stage? Does anybody feel like their organization might be there? Okay, a couple of hands, right? And that would be a very honest answer for many of us, unless you've got a well-defined risk acceptance process. And so documenting risk, this is crucial, and it feeds into a couple of things here in a minute. Okay, so once defined, all risk needs to be assessed and should be done. That's probably me just writing weird things on a slide last minute. Risk acceptance forms and processes are a great template. How many of you all have a risk acceptance form within your organization that you go through to assess risk? Does anybody have those? Okay, few hands. Okay, today, if you learn nothing else from this presentation, I want you to take back and apply into your culture, I need a risk acceptance form or template. Okay, and I'm going to show you a couple, or one of the ones that are hypothetically used by an organization I may or may not work for. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a great question. He's asking about risk tolerance versus risk acceptance. And if you have a tolerance for a certain level of risk within an organization, where do you require a risk acceptance form, another process to track that to happen? Can I defer the answer? Because I think I'm going to answer it later. And if not, re-ask the question and let's cover it. But yeah, coming up with a process that can be repeated, even if it's not the perfect process to begin with, is a great place to start. Okay, risk needs to be well documented, and undocumented risk is accepted with or without justification. If you've talked about it and it's been one of those things that, oh man, I told you guys that we were going to get hacked because we left the SSH port open on that web server that was exposed to the world, that's a lot of woulda, coulda, because it wasn't documented, it didn't go through that full process. So let's keep going. Let's talk about a risk acceptance form and give you kind of an overview. This one is very close to one of the ones that we use at the Utah Education Telehealth Network. Okay, it's not an exact copy because there's some more proprietary things for our specific functions and our specific processes that I wanted to keep internal. But in essence, it's something just like this. We have a form that we fill out often from the security office standpoint, and when we identify risk. So an employee name, this is generally meant for, hey, I want to do this new project. I need to understand what kind of security ramifications and other things come from this. And we ask the requester to fill out some information. Most of the time, unfortunately, it's the security officers, like I say, they're filling this out. But let's talk about a couple of things. General information, which we don't care about, which is pretty self-explanatory. But the first paragraph thing that they can start typing into this form is describe the risk requiring acceptance. Okay? Risk definition, risk identification. This is them or us as security professionals saying, hey, listen, Bob from HR wants me to leave SSH open on the Wayne web server. We keep using that as a great example because I've had that happen before. Because we need to SCP those files back and forth. We need to do it securely and things. So describe that risk, and then describe the business justification for the risk acceptance request, right? Seems pretty straightforward. Why does it need to be this way? Well, HR needs to send payroll off to the third party to do whatever kind of thing, right? And then provide a list of organization data and services that are potentially at risk by this request, okay? You're allowing them to say, well, let's see, we're going to be sending our banking information across this. It's going to be personal information, probably some social security numbers and some other things. And so it allows them to identify and tell you what some of that data is. Some of the times it's us, hey, we're going to be leaving one of our front door web servers open to another vector of attack that probably shouldn't exist. Anyways, let's move on. So this is, hey, that is a great question. And so the answer to that is you could. What I would say is, in fact, so for those of you and for the recording, the question was, by documenting a risk, does that create more liability? That's probably the better, for you as an organization, because now it's documented. You knew about it, kind of thing, right? And how does that impact cybersecurity insurance and all those other things? This is a wonderful question. I've got what I think is an okay answer. Did you have something to add to it? Right. Right. Yeah. And so, David, to your question specifically, I think that there could be some interpretation of increased liability if it's something is documented and not dealt with. Meaning, if you're just sitting back as a security or IT professional and you're just churning out risk acceptance documents, and all it is definition or identification definition and kind of understanding what the risk is, and then it just goes into a box somewhere, yeah, you could create some more liability for yourselves because this is part of that important process. And maybe, I might be just kind of supposing a little bit here, but maybe that's the fear or the risk that we're trying to avoid when I said, hey, who documents their risks? And not a lot of hands go up, because if I don't document it, then I can claim ignorance later or maybe anything else. But up here to your point, just like in a couple of slides ago, whether you identify it or not, it exists. And it's better for you to go through the process, but to avoid the problems of liability and other things, you've got to carry that process to the end of the row. Somebody needs to know about it, and we're going to talk about it here. In fact, it's probably one of the next slides here. Once you have it, in fact, let me defer, and some of this is going to be answered in a couple of slides here, but you've got to come up with compensating controls to start mitigating that risk, right? Because if we just document it and throw it in the bin, maybe we send it as an email up to the CTO or to some other executive like, hey, found another risk, but there's no compensating controls being built and developed to mitigate that risk, then yeah, there's some liability that can come as a result. But I want you to understand, in the security industry, compensating controls are the primary way that we reduce risk. The compensating control is the key term there. And this is anything we put in place to mitigate the risk or to mitigate the risk that we create that needs to be accepted. A couple of real quick examples in our web server SSH port thing would be that if we have to have that open, a compensating control could be something as simple as we put an access list on the system to only allow SSH to talk between two approved hosts. That would be a compensating control, right? Might not be the best control or the most appropriate control for that environment, but that's a compensating control. It could also just be that we have now a policy that we are going to review the SSH logs on an hourly basis on our web server. That's a compensating control. Now, one has a lot more likelihood of being successful than the other one, right? But all of those are compensating controls. This is how we mitigate risk, is we understand it and we put a control in place to mitigate it. Sometimes we can mitigate it to zero. Oftentimes, we leave a little bit of that risk on the table. And remember the formula up here, unmanaged or unmitigated risk minus security controls equals accepted risk at that point. And so there is always going to be a business decision that needs to be made on how much risk is tolerated within the organization. And I'm still going to answer the other half of that question here. Let's talk about how we control risk in this risk acceptance document here. Okay, this is pretty simplistic. This is part of the document that I pulled some things out of, but you're welcome to take a photo. It'll be in the slides and other things, but what is your proposed strategy for mitigating risk? Okay, this is just a continuation. So they've identified the risk, they've talked about it, and they've defined it and what the impact on organization data and resources. Well, what is the requester's proposal for mitigating this? And so you're automatically putting that person in that mindset. Okay, you as the user need to start thinking about what are the mitigating controls? What's the limit of that you can see that is the right approach for this so that it helps inform the security review later, okay? Provide a summary of the security controls that will be implemented by the requestor, okay? So, hey, I need to install VPN on every single phone, okay? We're going to, well, it's probably a bad example because everybody thinks that putting VPNs on phones is a good thing, right? But hey, we need secure email. And so the mitigating control might be, hey, we are going to implement VPN on everybody's phone. Maybe that's the better way to articulate that. So anyways, lost my train of thought. Now I'm going too many different places. Bottom line here is we go through a process of understanding and developing those security controls and understanding them. Go ahead. Not yet. You're jumping ahead again. Oh, that's great. In fact, I'm going to go through a little bit quicker here because there is a review process, okay? And so once you have the requester's information and some of these other things, and again, this process might not work 100% for you. You might have to come up with a different approach. This one's working pretty well for us, but once defined and documented, and we understand the impact and the security controls that are going to be there, you need to be able to convey risk clearly for acceptance, okay? And so that kind of leads to this next part of the form, section 2, where we go through a review process. And so this one gives us a level of risk where the security department or some other authoritative individual that has the responsibility for this role starts reading through, meeting with, making phone calls, exchanging emails, and understanding this whole scope. We go through that whole process again, And then these are the likely outcomes that we've identified within our organization, which is the risk that you're talking about is acceptable for us. And it's acceptable with maybe a reduced scope, or it's, hey, everything's fine. We're not going to have to do much. This is great. Or acceptable for a temporary period while other controls are improved, meaning like, hey, we got to go back and we got to upgrade firewalls now, and we've got to do all this stuff, but we'll put in this ACL kind of as a stopgap measure, and we'll fix these kinds of problems, but there's an ongoing component to it. Or fully acceptable without qualification, meaning that at this point there's nothing that needs to be done. Or there's a not acceptable, meaning that the residual risk is greater than the potential business benefit, and the risk acceptance is just flat out denied. We're not going to allow this to happen. Stamp, right? Or something that often happens for us is that, and if I might jump back and say, this is the security director and the security department within our organization's approval process. This is me in my role. I go through this and I look at this, and there's some things that I, as the security director, can say, yeah, we're good. This is compensated for. We've got good monitoring and management for this thing that you're trying to do. But there's oftentimes a new initiative. Those of you that are part of the education world that understand like CBRS, these are really cool terms. Anybody know what CBRS is? Okay, only a few of you. It's not going to translate well, but new initiatives that require all kinds of new security review and processes. I'll tell you what, when it happens, I kick that thing up to the CTO. I'm not the one that's responsible for saying, hey, this entire new initiative for our organization and for our business sits on me. And so there is a process to kind of kick it up the chain. Does that make sense? And then I'll just kind of move down here. I want to talk just briefly about accepting risk and who, right? Because I kind of alluded to it, and maybe this is part of a discussion that we can have with the audience here, but what are the acceptable levels of risk to be accepted at the following levels? What risk should the user be able to accept on their own without having to go up for more approval? Is there any? Does anybody have any opinions on that? So at what point as you identify a risk, there's some things that the user might be able to say, yeah, hey, it's okay. I'm going to type my password into that thing, phishing or otherwise. Go ahead. Okay, and so he's saying if the user's the expert in the area or in charge of their domain, right, that would make sense. And so what I see in this case is a lot of my personal use, not business use and other things. I'm the one that gets to decide what's acceptable. Like if I'm going to go put my personal email credentials into some weird form because I want to download a Minecraft plugin or something, that's my risk to accept, right? But is that appropriate for a business-related account and other things, right? Kind of helping you understand the foundation of what I'm asking here. And if we take this discussion to the end of the road, this is a lot of splitting of hairs and things in here, but what I want you to kind of get from this is that there are appropriate risks that can be accepted at these different levels, but you have to define in your organization, and that's kind of to bring this kind of into a conclusion, you've got to figure out within your organization where your risk tolerance is, to your point. Like, what is the accepted tolerance of risk? We're a low tolerance. We have high security. We don't allow people to even change, or we don't even allow people to not change their password every 90 days. And we force two-factor authentication. We do all of the things with low tolerance, right? Or we have high tolerance. Maybe, and not to throw education folks under the bus, but in an education environment when you've got thousands of students in a school district and they all need access to their Chromebooks and everything else, I'll tell you what, the username and password that you're using and sending out to all those students is not a super complex one. It has to be something that you can, hey student, here's your password again for the 4th time this week, right? Kinds of things. Go ahead. Okay, and so that's a great question. The question was, what example in our organization do we allow a user to accept the risk on their own? And the answer is, in our organization, there isn't a lot. There's almost zero. Meaning, I wanted to bring this up in case somehow it was relevant to some organization or for your own personal thing. But for our organization, it's not acceptable for a user to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to do this funky thing with my credential. Now, does it stop them from doing that? It absolutely does not. This is where phishing and vishing and some of these other things occur, right? This is the vulnerability at this user making their decision at their level to accept some risk, okay? And sometimes it's not really clearly defined for them. They don't know that they're doing this type of thing. And so it's important for us as IT and security professionals to help them recognize these things. But it's the same thing with IT staff. How many of you guys feel like you would pass, all of you IT and security staff in here, how many of you would pass 100% every single time any phishing attack that comes in and drops into your email box or onto your phone as a text or anything else? Anybody feel confident to say, yeah, I'm 100%? Okay, right. Thank you for not raising your hands, because that's probably an accurate representation. We have our own vulnerabilities, even at our level, of accepting some risk sometimes. Like, oh, you know what? It's just easier for me to give admin to Bob over here so we can install that printer and just get off my back. And he needs domain admin credentials to do that, right? And so on and so forth. And so there's different levels. The appropriateness is not definable by me for you and your organization, and that's the key component here. So what I've done here is I've filled in a couple of gaps, and I've said, you need a risk acceptance process, and some of that is ubiquitous, meaning that the math in the first slides doesn't change, Accepted risk is a result of all these other components and compensating controls and the whole thing all melted together. But risk tolerance, as to your point earlier, and other things become part of how you have to define that within your own organization. And so the examples that I put up here of our risk acceptance process template might be valid and appropriate for something like you're doing, but it might not even touch how you need to be doing those types of things. My recommendations are that you spend the time to go through and better your security situation by developing something if you don't have a key piece of this within your organization. If you do great in identifying and defining but not documenting, start with documenting and then work your way down the list. Go ahead one more time. Mm-hmm. So for those of you in the back that might not, and let me ask the question back just to make sure I got it. So that in the position of you have security folks that are going out and they're identifying risks and other things, but if they assess it as low risk, can they just accept it and not have to go through the documentation process? Okay, document it within a ticket, gotcha. To kick it up or accept it or reject it, right? Right. So what I would call that kind of approach is in an environment where you need to be a little bit more nimble and there's good, well-established boundaries on, yes, one of our IT security people can say yes or no to this type of scenario, and that those are understood, then that's an appropriate approach. Meaning, let's document a ticket. Bob asked for domain admin credentials, and I said no, right? It doesn't need to go through a whole, hey, should we give it to him, and what's the risk, and everything else. Some of those are going to be obvious, right? And so what I would say is that would be risk acceptance light. Having a streamlined process for the easy to derive things is going to be more beneficial. It's going to save you a lot of time, but those need to have really clearly defined boundaries. And that's the key component to that, is you need to understand this is where I can't approve things versus where I can, and really understanding that well. Right. And he's saying anything above like a low level requires that process to be completed, and that's an appropriate approach. And so where those lows and the mediums and the highs for you and your organization are going to be different from you and yours, and so you've got to go figure those things out. But again, my plea and my recommendation is figure out where you are in the risk acceptance process and finish developing that and building it out so that you've got better opportunity to see it, understand it, communicate it up to higher ups, and get them to accept it if they need to be the ones to accept it. And what it ultimately helps you do in the end is keep things inventoried and understood and get the right people accepting that risk, because some of it is accepted at your level here or here, depending on where you are. But some of it should be the CEO saying, you know what, we're not going to do this, or we are going to do this because I'm making that decision. And then it's not on your shoulders. Okay, this is that you get to lift that burden off your shoulders. You can be in that I told you so mode of, hey, listen, I sent you an email about this last month before we got compromised. What I would hope you would do is not take that kind of approach as much as make sure that it's not on you because you didn't document it and you didn't know about it, or that you didn't follow it to the end of the road. Okay, so that's really it. I've got some other slides and other things, but to go through more would probably burn you out. Any questions that I haven't answered that anybody has about risk acceptance process? He's got a million of them up here. Before I take his, anybody else first? Going once, twice? Okay, go ahead then. Okay. Okay, so before you keep going, I want to kind of, for the back of the room that's hard to hear. So you've got processes in place and things, and you give department heads some ability to accept risk and kind of make some of these decisions and things, but you rarely take things to like an executive, like a CEO or whatever, because of lack of high confidence in an appropriate judgment level. For them, it's Greek. It's SS what? Or web what kind of thing, right? Okay. And so was there a question there that I missed, or? Okay, so the question is, are we missing something there? And what I would say is, um, maybe not. I mean, if you've got a good structure where you've got department heads that know what their roles are, and data stewards for data classification that know what their roles are, and that approvals for access rights and all these other things are well built out, then it sounds like you've probably got a really good environment for risk acceptance and monitoring and things. And yeah, you don't necessarily have to take everything to the CEO of an organization. In fact, it's very rare in our organization that I'm talking to our chief executive about these things. Almost every single thing that we do within UETN, if I don't feel comfortable making the call, and that's kind of a subjective thing. I feel comfortable in making a lot of calls, and I've got the respect within my organization that when I say no, they're like, okay, I get it and understand. But sometimes, yeah, I'll have to kick it up to the CTO, and that's about as high as it gets in our organization. And that seems appropriate. You need somebody sometimes to say, no, you guys can't do that because they're not listening to me, or I'm trying to have that discussion back and forth. And so use it to your advantage where you need to. Like, hey, if I need to go up to the chief executive up here and talk about this, then maybe that's what we'll have to do. And then at that point, the chief executive might side with the person that you're having odds with, and then it's a business decision. It's like, yes, we got to do this. I told Bob over here that we got to have this system up, and it's got to be up tonight. And you're like, well, listen, we don't even have a firewall to put in front of the thing. Like there's some risk here. And if it's a business decision, then it's a business decision. Right. I mean, again, you got it, and he says whether the requests come from the CEO or not, and how it all comes. It creates politics, which we love. There's a political layer in the OSI model. That's probably resonates with some of you, right? We all know that there's the political layer, and it does exist. Okay, one more question, Michael, or actually, I'll come back to you too, but go ahead. Wasn't that a great keynote this morning? Yeah, let me illustrate this for a lot of you technical people in the room. Local admin. Okay? How many of you are all just cringing right now by me saying that, right? This is the perfect example of you allowing a user to make risk judgments of their own accord because you've allowed them local admin on their machine, right? And it's the bane of our existence. Those of us, especially those of us that work in education, where every single day there's a new teacher that needs a new thing installed on their computer to do things. And it's just easier to say, here's local admin, get out of my hair. I do not want to come over there for the 4th time this week and install your software for you, kind of thing. But that's an example of kind of what we're talking about. But you also asked a different question or different component there that I want to answer and say, user education, training, and other things within your organization. We saw that. Jason did an incredible job. I was super thrilled with his keynote this morning, where he's talking about having to understand and the social components and getting good training. Snow did also a good example of understanding that 0.5% of our time as IT and security professionals actually goes to training our employees what they should be doing. And so there is risk in us not doing what we're supposed to do. Did I cover what you were asking? Is that a good response? I might come back to you if you have another minute, or you come up afterwards and I'll because I might have forgotten part of your question. In the back, last question. Ooh. That is a great question. And I wish I just had oh yeah, you just do it like this. But that adds a whole new dimension that many of us are probably facing already, meaning that what I've presented up here is very simplistic compared to now I've got multiple clouds that I'm living in, and what are they doing to protect my data? And it's a third party that we've contracted for our HR system. So PeopleSoft has all of our data and all these different things. Absolutely, that complicates things. And every time that you are so the best answer I have for you right now, quickly and on the spot, is any time that you are handing off the responsibility of your IT and your infrastructure to somebody else, whether that's just to a cloud and you still admin it, or whether that's to a third party that's just going to handle it, that should always have a risk acceptance process that accompanies that decision. You should never do something like that without a risk acceptance process. Like, there is risk that, hey, that data could be compromised from the PeopleSoft side. I'm throwing PeopleSoft under the bus, not on purpose, but that's one that comes to mind, right? But they get compromised and our data is gone. Like, we have nothing we can do about that. And there's some risk there that needs to be understood and accepted in doing some of those types of things. Now, sometimes it makes it a whole lot easier, and it's a cost decision, and all those things cloud it and make it complicated, but yes. I'll get sneaky in. Go ahead. Right. Did you guys all hear that okay? Or do I need to repeat it? So what he's saying is, well, now I'm almost forgotten. It was so eloquently put, but that when you contract with those folks, and part of that risk acceptance process should be that they're contractually obligated to be liable for their storage of that data and everything else. But what he's also saying is, and it's very apropos and appropriate, is that even if you said 100% of the liability is yours, that's never going to be true. The reputation, the fact that your data is compromised and other things will never be zero liability to you. And so again, there is some risk there. You're hoping that PeopleSoft and those folks are doing a really good job at doing things. Let me throw out one other tidbit. I want you to write this one down if you're in this situation. Okay, if you're thinking about bringing on a third party for a service or a software as a service and those types of things, there is a really cool form that was developed in higher education that you can easily translate over into commercial if that's the space that you're in. I know we still have a lot of educators and education in here, but write down the term HECVAT, HECVAT, okay, and search that on Google. That is probably one of the best refined checklist item things that you should be reviewing for every third-party engagement. Now, not all of it's going to translate perfectly for you in all situations, but it's a great framework to work off of if you're doing that. It's not necessarily part of risk acceptance as much as it's risk definition and kind of understanding what that really means and what should be taken care of to make that work. So anyways, I'll end it there because we're at 4:30 and I never thought I'd even go this long. But it's my pleasure to have you here, and thank you for coming and joining us. We'll see you either downstairs in a little bit if you want to come trade a Yoda or badge for a Yoda badge, or I might have some other ones in my pockets that I can hand out for the mini badges. You're welcome to come see me. I'll be down at the Badge Life community booth probably for the next half hour, 45 minutes at least. But thank you, and have an awesome con.